Christian psychology has its roots in Christian philosophy in recent past. As a result, two of the leaders of the Christian psychology approach have been philosophers. And the person who wrote the chapter for the first Four Views book, Robert Roberts, is a philosopher and gave a philosophical cast to his presentation. In this latest version, Paul Watson was invited to collaborate with Dr. Roberts on the writing of the chapter of the Christian psychology approach. And that's very fitting because Dr. Watson is a researcher primarily. He has published over 150 studies in mainstream psychology journals, covering a range of topics, including the eating behavior of rats, the non-motor functions of the cerebellum, behavior research design, the behavior of learning disabled children, narcissism, private self-consciousness and attributional style, mystical religious experience, an article or two on René Girard, which you should ask him about afterwards, and over 15 articles exploring the psychology of religion with colleagues in Iran. He's also been the editor of the Journal of Psychology for the past 9 years and has reviewed articles for over 25 mainstream psychology journals. And he's currently the editor of Edification, the journal of the Society for Christian Psychology. But he may not talk about it today, but his most important contribution has been the development of a number of research tools to try and analyze the effect of what I would call worldview perspective on research, but to do so from a quantitative, from an empirical standpoint. And it's honestly remarkable. And it's no small tragedy that his body of work in this area has not been picked up by mainstream researchers, and it's an even greater tragedy that not enough Christian researchers are aware of this very profound, and I consider it remarkable, contribution to the field of empirical study, but to analyze worldview, the impact of worldview on the research itself. So I also should add that he's done some distinctively Christian research on the topic of beliefs about sin. That is a distinct Christian psychology type of research. So we're honored to have you here, Dr. Watson. Thank you.
Well, I just want to thank Eric. I also want to thank Bob Roberts for putting up with me. He's a great person, and I will give a very different presentation than he would have given if he had been here today. And it was an honor to work with Bob, and I had read lots of Bob's work before I worked with him, and I certainly appreciate everything he has done. And actually, I am kind of the B team in this, and so it would be great if Bob could be here too. And finally, I want to thank my daughter who helped me with PowerPoint. I'm guilty of the low quality of the PowerPoint, but at least I had a daughter who would help me. And so I want to make sure that she gets credit too. And so I am going to try to talk about the things that Eric mentioned. I am going to talk about the kinds of research strategies that I've been trying to pursue. And I am going to try to be sort of a big tent approach to things. I want to try to, Eric didn't say this, maybe he didn't want to falsify me in front of the crowd, but I am a Quaker. And so I am going to try to make as much peace as I possibly can today. I deeply believe in peace, and I believe that everyone here is saying something that needs to be heard, and we need to join together as a community, working together, figuring out how we can be colleagues and friends to advance something that we all believe is very important. And so I am not here to win any arguments. If we argue at 4 o'clock, I will refuse to argue. And so my goal is to praise everyone. And what I'm going to say is going to be tentative. It's not going to be a fully formed picture, but it is an attempt to put everything together. And so I'm going to try to do that today. And I'm going to do that in terms of, as you'll see in my presentation, a focus on this notion of incommensurability. Christians who are psychologists must answer a centrally important question. Are Christianity and contemporary psychology incommensurable? Notice that this question in no way implies that the two might be incompatible. The excellent work of so many Christian psychologists already makes it clear that the two are quite compatible to some important degree. To be incommensurable simply means instead that Christianity and contemporary psychology might fail to share the same ultimate standard. Without a shared ultimate standard, the central claims of each could not be judged definitively along a common metric of evaluation that is embraced by both. Incommensurable perspectives therefore operate from essentially different systems of rationality. Assumptions in one are warranted if they can be appropriately related to an ultimate standard of evaluation that is unavailable in the other. So the question about incommensurability turns out to have broader implications. Do Christianity and contemporary psychology rest upon ultimately different systems of rationality? Christian psychology argues that any adequate response to this question must have at least 4 elements. First, an adequate response must explain why incommensurability is in fact an unavoidable and critical problem for all Christians working in psychology. Second, an adequate response will need to explain why the problem of incommensurability may be so difficult for some Christians to see or to admit. Third, if it is to be fully effective, an adequate response to this question will need to make sense within the current cultural context. That context is sometimes described as postmodern. The argument of Christian psychology is that postmodernism cannot be ignored, but that Christian psychologists will need to move beyond postmodernism toward more productive cultural possibilities. I apologize for my cough. It's going to come up every once in a while. Finally, Christian psychology will argue that an adequate response to this question will need to include a tentative model of how we all might work together to meet the challenges of incommensurability. With regard to the next thing. First, Christian psychology assumes that Christianity and psychology are necessarily incommensurable. For a psychology to be truly Christian, the final standard of evaluation must presumably be Christ. That standard is obviously unavailable within a secularized social science like psychology. Christian and secular psychologists might therefore agree. Incommensurability is a rather obvious and relatively non-controversial empirical reality. But perhaps it's unfair to make presumptions about how others might view this particular issue. Arguments might be made for placing both Christ and the assumptions of secular psychology under the evaluation of a shared higher standard. That standard could then make it possible to judge both Christ and psychology along a common metric of evaluation. But such arguments will also need to explain how this approach can support the development of a truly Christian psychology, rather than the development of a psychology of the proposed higher standard. If such arguments exist, they should be listened to carefully and evaluated fairly. Christian psychology nevertheless remains skeptical. The likelihood seems remote that a psychology without Christ as its ultimate standard could still operate as a truly Christian psychology. In short, for Christian psychology, the most likely conclusion seems clear. Christianity and contemporary psychology are founded upon different ultimate standards. They therefore operate as incommensurable, though not necessarily incompatible, systems of rationality. Again, incommensurability seems to be a rather obvious and relatively non-controversial empirical reality. Second, Christian psychology suspects that other Christian approaches to psychology insufficiently address the challenge of incommensurability. Conflicts about the role of psychology in Christianity often seem to focus on whether or not the two can be compatible. But again, that is the wrong question. Incommensurability, not incompatibility, is the problem. It also may be a problem that is difficult for some Christians to see. Alasdair MacIntyre, a well-known philosopher who began his work in Great Britain but now lives in the United States, MacIntyre has made the issue of incommensurability a central concern in his philosophy. Most of us, he suggests, live within the conceptual framework of a single perspective. When this is so, the problem of understanding the position of the other, and this is a quote, the problem of understanding the position of the other will appear as a problem of translation. How can we render their beliefs, arguments, and theses into our terms? Such individuals will not even see incommensurability as a potential problem. Their confident assumption will be that all propositions of another perspective can be expressed within their own language of understanding. A scientific worldview, for example, may suggest that all religious assertions can be translated as rational or as irrational. A Christian worldview may instead claim that all scientific assertions can be translated as faithful or as sinful. Those who see a high correspondence between the rational and the faithful and between the irrational and the sinful will assume that Christianity and psychology are largely compatible. Those who instead claim that the rational corresponds to the sinful and that the irrational to the faithful will describe the two as largely incompatible. Less polarized positions are, of course, possible. Most importantly, however, this focus on the degree of compatibility makes it virtually impossible to see incommensurability as even a potential problem. But even when Christians can see the potential difficulty, they may be tempted to ignore it. To take the problem of incommensurability seriously might seem to require an unacceptable surrender to relativism. Incommensurability does, after all, suggest the existence of isolated rationalities that are incapable of meaningful dialogue with and critique of other rationalities. MacIntyre argues, however, that relativism is not a necessary consequence of incommensurability. Progress in addressing the problems of incommensurability requires people who are fluent in the rationalities of multiple perspectives. Such individuals will understand from the outset that one perspective cannot rationally defeat the other, because the two forms of understanding are calibrated to incommensurable standards of evaluation. Such individuals will try to instead to use one perspective to out-narrate all other positions that see translation as the only solution to conflicts between perspectives. Relativism can be avoided. The productive response to incommensurability is not to use reason, but rather to use narration. Christian psychology can therefore be conceptualized as an ongoing project to narrate the problem of incommensurability that necessarily confronts Christians who work in psychology. Christian psychology needs to tell a story that refuses to ignore the challenges of incommensurability, that avoids the dangers of relativism, and that suggests how psychology might function with Christ as the ultimate standard. That story will also need to narrate our current cultural context and then attempt to narrate our future so that we can all begin to understand how to collaborate in expanding the reach of Christian rationality. A focus on incommensurability obviously presupposes that scientific forms of rationality have limits. Again, incommensurability simply means that the ultimate standards of secular science do not and cannot be those of Christianity and vice versa. Each, in other words, operates within the limits of its own standards. Those convinced of the full adequacy of the sciences to judge even Christianity will want to reject this kind of thinking. This rejection will reflect a modernist faith or a positivist faith, to use Stanton's term, a positivist faith in the sciences that is challenged by the increasingly influential arguments of postmodernism. The postmodern belief is that all scientific observations are based upon non-empirical, theory-laden prejudgments. Science, like religion, also rests upon normative values and therefore can never be fully objective. The increasingly postmodern cultural context has at least 4 implications for efforts to address the problems of incommensurability. First, postmodern critiques make it clear that science, like psychology, is ideological. As defined by McIntyre, ideologies are somewhat non-empirical, normative, and sociological systems of belief. Christianity assumes that God created the universe. Science argues that the universe began with the Big Bang. All kinds of empirical observations can be organized around each assumption, but neither God nor the Big Bang can be definitively confirmed or falsified scientifically. These somewhat non-empirical assumptions will then have unavoidable normative consequences. And this is a quote from McIntyre. An ideology does not merely tell us how the world is and how we are to act, but is concerned with the bearing of the one upon the other. Christian and scientific pursuits of truth, for example, will necessarily reflect methods that are consistent with their very different non-empirical assumptions. All of this has sociological implications as well. As McIntyre points out, and this is a quote, there is a Christian account of why the Christians are Christians and the heathens are not. Science, too, will have accounts of who is a believer within the scientific community and who is a heathen. In short, any adequate approach to the problem of incommensurability will begin with an understanding that both Christianity and the science of secular psychology operate within different ideological surrounds. In other words, Christianity and science operate according to the different, somewhat non-empirical, normative, and sociological assumptions that define each intellectual endeavor. Formal attention to these differing ideological surrounds will therefore be essential. Second, again, we're talking about what Christian psychology thinks is a necessary response to the postmodern cultural context. Second, many Christian psychologists will want to move beyond postmodernism. Postmodern critiques can seem to trap Christians in an untenable situation. A historically naive, pre-modern reading of Christianity cannot easily address the realities of an increasingly pluralistic and scientific world. A full embrace of modernist rationality seems ill-suited to solve the unavoidable problems of incommensurability. Postmodernism seems to accurately describe the contemporary cultural context, but it also points toward a disturbing relativism. If everything is ideological, then presumably nothing and everything can be true at the same time. None of this seems to be acceptable. In response to this situation, Christians have begun to call for the development of, and this is a quote, and I apologize for the term, and Al Duick at Fuller gave me a hard time about using this term, but it's not mine, I'm not guilty. Christians have begun to call for the development of a postmodernism. We may have, we may need to start squaring and cubing and to the fourth power, doing these posts to make it easier. This is postmodernist. I didn't make it up, I'm just stuck with it, I'm sorry. Millard Erickson writes, for example, we must work toward a postmodernism, not simply ignoring the phenomenon of postmodernism and reverting back to a pre-postmodernism, but also not halting with postmodernism. Robert Greer adds that in the postmodern paradigm, absolute truth has a name, Jesus Christ. In other words, Christian psychologists can embrace the problem of incommensurability as an opportunity. They can begin with the assumption that Christ supplies the absolute ultimate standard for a psychology, and then develop a different rationality based upon that standard. These postmodern Christian psychologists will therefore understand that a relativity of perspectives is an undeniable empirical reality in the contemporary cultural context. They will also know, however, that relativity as an empirical reality does not dictate relativism as a normative standard. Relativism must be overcome. This cannot occur through the use of a scientifically objective rationality. A wholly objective scientific rationality simply cannot exist. The task instead will be to challenge relativism with an increasingly compelling Christian narration of psychology and rationality. Third, again, we're talking about the Christian response to postmodernism. A postmodern response to incommensurability will require the social construction of what might be called a meta-perspective. In other words, Christians in psychology will need to create a perspective of understanding that is developed at a higher level of abstraction. The need for a meta-perspective was in fact suggested by the philosopher who stood at the origins of postmodernism, Friedrich Nietzsche. While he passionately criticized Christianity, Nietzsche also rejected the claim that science could ever be fully objective. Science, he argued instead, invariably reflects perspectives motivated by diverse subjective interests. Hence, a scientific view on any particular issue is invariably limited by its interests. For Nietzsche, the solution to this problem was what he called a future objectivity. In the future, objectivity will require an openness to diverse interests and the use, and I'm quoting Nietzsche here, and the use of a variety of perspectives and affective interpretations in the service of knowledge. In the service of Christian knowledge, a postmodern approach to psychology will need to socially construct a meta-perspective that uses future objectivity. This future objectivity will need to bring all relevant perspectives into conformity with a rationality that takes Christ as its ultimate standard. Finally, and this is the fourth Christian psychology response to postmodernism, finally, therefore, a Christian psychology will want to collaborate with all Christians in psychology to narrate a future in which the problem of incommensurability is embraced as an opportunity. That narration will attempt to construct a future objectivity that includes three most important elements: Christ as the ultimate standard, a meta-perspective that evaluates the potential contributions of all Christian psychologists relative to that ultimate standard, and the various perspectives that psychologists use in the service of Christian knowledge. An ideal narration of the future must therefore include the important contributions of all perspectives that Christians use in their work as psychologists. More specifically, future development of Christian rationality as it relates to psychology will require the social construction of a meta-perspective that is capable of evaluating Christian perspectives that represent three very different forms of intellectual endeavor. These three different forms of intellectual endeavor can be called the etic, the emic, and the dialogic. In anthropology, etic research perspectives involve a study of human communities using the outside, relatively more objective methods of science. Postmodern critiques make it clear that etic research can never be wholly objective. Etic research programs, nevertheless, maintain a useful distance from issues that can make it possible to see things more broadly than is sometimes possible within the too close perspectives of persons living within the community itself. Individuals within a Christian community, in other words, may become so enmeshed with one or another approach to a question that they are unable to see the full possibilities of their own Christian rationality. Etic research perspectives therefore have the obvious advantage of using powerful scientific methodologies to empirically clarify Christian concerns. At the same time, however, an etic perspective can promote the colonization of Christian communities by scientific value systems. In short, the etic perspective has clarification as its advantage and colonization as its potential disadvantage. To some degree, and I'm not calling names, I'm just making suggestions here, to some degree, the levels of explanation approach to Christianity and psychology may illustrate the etic perspective. In anthropology, emic research perspectives involve the study of human communities using the inside, less objective perspectives of the community itself. For Christians working in the service of knowledge, emic research programs seek to express forms of psychological understanding that are possible within the faith itself. The Bible and the available texts and traditions of interpretation will be at the center of methodologies designed to enhance the articulation and actualization of Christian community. At the same time, however, Christian emic research programs could be so deeply embedded with a very particular and perhaps overly narrow theological perspective on the faith that they could encourage a retreat into an increasingly isolated and besieged ghetto of interpretation. In short, the emic perspective has actualization as its advantage and ghettoization as its potential disadvantage. To some degree, again, I'm not calling names, I'm just making suggestions, the biblical counseling perspective may illustrate the emic perspective. For Christians working in psychology, etic and emic research programs will be necessary but not sufficient. Etic scientific and emic Christian perspectives must be brought into conversation. Dialogic research programs pursue this essential task. Such research programs explicitly explore the possibilities of translating scientific psychological insights into the language of Christianity and vice versa. Dialogic research could nevertheless produce what might be described as a disinterpretation of the conversational possibilities. Disinterpretations presumably would have at least some conceptual and empirical foundations of support, so they could not be called simple misinterpretations. Disinterpretations would instead reflect deviations from normatively ideal translations. In other words, deviations from the ultimate standard defined by Christ. Two possibilities seem most obvious. One deviation could be toward an etic colonization of the faith, whereas the other could encourage an emic ghettoization, and my suspicion is there are many other possible disinterpretations. In short, dialogic research programs have translation as their advantage and disinterpretation as their potential disadvantage. To some degree, the integration approach to psychology and Christianity may illustrate the dialogic perspective. This conceptual framework now makes it possible for Christian psychology to begin narrating the future by answering three important questions. These questions will address concerns about how Christians in psychology can embrace the problem of incommensurability by socially constructing the rationality of their own meta-perspective. First, what must Christians in psychology do in order to construct their Christian meta-perspective? The answer now should be clear, at least in very general terms. With Christ as their ultimate standard of evaluation, Christians in psychology will need to develop concepts and methodologies that are useful in promoting clarification, actualization, and translation, while simultaneously avoiding colonization, ghettoization, and disinterpretation. Second, which Christians in psychology will need to construct this meta-perspective? The answer is that all Christians in psychology will need to contribute. The levels of interpretation, biblical counseling, and integration views will each need to create knowledge that is useful in fulfilling the potentials of each perspective. In addition, however, advocates of these views will also need to express arguments that rise above their own perspective and make points about their discoveries at the higher level of a Christian meta-perspective. Finally, what is the role of Christian psychology in particular in all this? Christian psychology, along perhaps with transformational psychology, will embrace the task of developing the Christian meta-perspective as a formal responsibility. Progress in this task will be obvious in the creation of an increasingly sophisticated and uniquely Christian rationality about psychology. That rationality will need to work within two contexts. Within the Christian community itself, Christian psychology will want to develop conceptual and methodological innovations that are useful in promoting clarification, actualization, and translation, and in avoiding colonization, ghettoization, and disinterpretation. However, Christian psychology will also understand the importance of working outside the Christian community. To limit Christian rationality within the boundaries of its own community would promote an unacceptable cultural ghettoization of Christian perspectives. In opposition to that possibility, Christian psychology would hope to articulate an ever more compelling Christian rationality that could enter into increasingly productive conversations with all the other rationalities that influence the discipline of psychology and the wider world today. In short, as it attempts to narrate the problem of incommensurability, Christian psychology will be interested not only in the insights that are available from etic, emic, and dialogic research programs. A perhaps more basic goal will be to develop concepts and methodologies that are useful in building up a communal meta-perspective for all Christians who work in psychology. With Christ as the ultimate standard, Christian psychology will use the Bible and Christian texts and traditions of interpretation to define an increasingly dynamic and sophisticated Christian rationality. A theology of clarification, for example, may be essential in helping the Christian community know how to obtain the full and faithful benefits of the levels of explanation perspective. I take that to be exactly what Warren was trying to do last night. He is with resonance, he is trying to begin the articulation of a very important meta-perspective understanding of what's happening in the levels of explanation approach. He's trying to create, in a way, a theology of clarification. How can I clarify these levels of influence that exist on persons, and how can I take that clarification and articulate that clarification at a higher theological level? So everyone in the levels of explanation, there are going to be many ways of doing that, but what Warren showed last night was an example. I had no idea what one would look like, and I was sitting there last night. That's it. That's what I'm looking for. I'm not saying I bought the whole thing. I'm just saying that's a good example. Thank God he did that. Then I don't have to talk about it or pretend I know something I don't know. But that was an example of a theology of clarification. With a theology of clarification, for example, we've already said that. Theological evaluations of the potential problems of ghettoization may be essential in actualizing the promise of biblical counseling. Disinterpretation as a possible danger of the integration perspective is likely to be a complex phenomenon that will require the careful analysis of a sophisticated Christian rationality. Empirical research will be essential as well. The Christian psychology research program will assume that science, like religion, operates within an ideological surround. This means that science will not have access to an unambiguous objectivity that is unavailable to religion. Both science and religion will instead have incommensurable, though not necessarily incompatible, forms of objectivity. Each form of objectivity will operate within its own normatively defined ideological surround. Awareness of that fact will have two most important implications for the empirical research programs of Christian psychology. I've already said there have to be conceptual innovations like a theology of clarification, but there have to be empirical methodological innovations as well. First, Christian psychology will seek to encourage the development of measures and procedures that directly express the rationality of a Christian ideological surround. In other words, Christian psychology will identify an operationalization, for those of you who have been tortured with a research class, will identify an operationalization of the Christian tradition as a centrally important research objective. Traditional Christianity assumes, for example, that the achievement of better psychological functioning requires awareness of personal sinfulness. Beliefs about sin scales have attempted to express 4 dimensions of that awareness. The self-improvement scale is reflected in the claim, "My beliefs about sin have helped me work on my weaknesses." Illustrating perfectionism avoidance is the statement, "Knowledge of my personal sinfulness has lifted the burden from my shoulders of trying to be perfect." An example of healthy humility is the belief, "My awareness of sin helps me maintain an appropriate humility." Self-reflective functioning includes such statements as, "My beliefs about sin have made it possible for me to be more objective about myself." Use of these scales has first made it possible to demonstrate that beliefs about sin, in fact, measure psychological health in largely Christian samples. Specifically, these 4 scales were associated with greater self-esteem and lower levels of narcissism, depression, and anxiety. Self-improvement now I'm going to add one thing. Simultaneous use of these measures to predict mental health also produced unexpected results. That's the nice thing about research. You don't always confirm your expectations, and you find things that you wouldn't have expected to see. And so speaking of those unexpected results, self-improvement proved to be centrally important in defining the mental health benefits of beliefs about sin. Surprisingly, healthy humility turned out to be unhealthy when statistical procedures controlled for the influence of self-improvement. The latter results seemed especially important in spotlighting the essential contribution of empirical research in understanding how Christian rationality operates today. When working with clients, Christian therapists and biblical counselors presumably would need to be aware of the possible importance of self-improvement and of the potential vulnerabilities associated with an unmitigated healthy humility. Such knowledge would not be easily available to these therapists and counselors except through the use of formal, empirical, social scientific procedures. Again, the ideological nature of research has a second important implication for Christian psychology. The first was operationalizing the tradition, but there's a second implication. Operationalizing the tradition would be only one aspect of a research program in Christian psychology. New methodologies also need to explore the incommensurable rationalities of Christianity and contemporary psychology. 5 procedures have been developed thus far for that purpose. They are direct rational analysis, empirical translation schemes, correlational marker procedures, comparative rationality analysis, and statistical controls for ideology. We're going to look at each one, sort of thumbnail sketch quickly, and I apologize for torturing you with data. I've tried to leave the numbers out, but hopefully the basic ideas will get there. Direct rational analysis may be especially useful in documenting a potential psychological bias against Christian rationality. A scale reflecting a non-religious existential ideology, for example, measures whether people tend to maintain an unhealthy avoidance of the harsh realities of life, like meaninglessness, suffering, and death. Correlational evidence, in fact, demonstrates that this scale can predict both sincere Christian commitments and anxiety. Such data, therefore, do point toward a linkage of Christian commitments with an anxious refusal to confront the harsh existential realities of life. However, this scale associates existential avoidance as the thing the scale is measuring with an affirmation that God exists and with the belief that it is quite certain what happens after death. Instead of accurately measuring existential avoidance, these questions may merely reveal instead the somewhat non-empirical, anti-religious assumptions of an existentialist ideological surround. Most Orthodox Christians presumably would regard belief in God and certainty about what happens after death as reflecting a healthy confrontation with the harsh realities of life. A direct rational analysis of all statements within this scale therefore suggested that some items contradicted Christian faith and essentially defined an anti-Christian subscale. Other items appeared to be unobjectionable within a Christian ideological surround and could be described as a Christian neutral subscale. A reanalysis of these data using these subscales revealed that the association of sincere Christian faith with existential avoidance was limited solely to the anti-Christian items. The scale was just informing you that Christians believe in God and in an afterlife. The Christian neutral subscale explained the linkage of existential avoidance with anxiety. As a consequence, the initial finding of a correlation between existential avoidance and sincere Christian commitments merely demonstrated that the original scale was biased against Christian beliefs in God and the afterlife. In other words, the original scale had the potential to colonize Christian commitments in terms of an existential ideological surround. With regard to empirical translation schemes, Christians over recent decades have appropriately emphasized contrast between Christian and secular humanistic understandings of psychological well-being. Such arguments move easily and plausibly toward the suggestion that humanistic self-actualization is wholly incompatible with Christian forms of mental health. But is humanistic self-actualization more incommensurable than incompatible with Christianity? Empirical translation schemes helped answer that question. In this procedure, each statement of a humanistic self-actualization scale was restated in a number of hypothetically comparable expressions of Christian self-actualization. In largely Christian samples, an empirically defensible translation became obvious if a potential Christian translation correlated positively with the original humanistic statement of self-actualization. One humanistic expression of self-actualization said, for example, "I can like people without having to approve of them." A successful Christian translation asserted instead, "Christ's love for sinners has taught me to love people regardless of their background and lifestyle." A Christian self-actualization scale made up of successful translations predicted higher levels of Christian commitment and turned out to be a much more useful measure of self-actualization than the humanistic scale in measuring Christian psychological adjustment. Self-actualization, when calibrated to Christ as the ultimate standard, therefore proved to be even more valid as a measure of Christian psychological well-being. In other words, these particular humanistic articulations of self-actualization were not incompatible, but rather incommensurable with Christian commitments. An extreme emic rejection of self-actualization could consequently promote a ghettoization of Christian perspectives. Also worth emphasizing is the fact that this particular humanistic scale was at least somewhat successful in predicting Christian mental health. Researchers could therefore legitimately use this humanistic scale as a valid measure of self-actualization in Christian samples. The empirical translation scheme results nevertheless demonstrated that to do so would lead to a disinterpretation of Christian self-functioning. Data based upon this scale would encourage a disinterpretation, not because they were wholly wrong in suggesting the possibility of Christian self-actualization, but rather because they were insufficiently calibrated to Christ as the ultimate standard. A further analysis, I apologize. A further analysis of the self-actualization issue used a correlational marker procedure. This research strategy rested upon the use of a psychological scale that had well-established credentials as a valid measure of Christian commitments. In other words, this scale displayed what might be called tradition validity because it successfully assessed what research participants sincerely tried. It successfully assessed whether research participants sincerely tried to follow the assumptions of their own Christian rationality. Such a scale, therefore, could serve as a marker of traditional Christian commitments. One study of a largely Christian sample correlated a tradition-valid measure of religious commitment with each of 150 separate items from a completely different humanistic self-actualization scale. Some humanistic items correlated positively with the tradition-valid scale and thus could be marked as pro-Christian. One pro-Christian statement said, for example, "I do not have feelings of resentment about things that are past." Christian and humanistic ideological surrounds therefore agree that feelings of resentment interfere with self-actualization. Other items correlated negatively with the religious commitment scale and thus served as markers of anti-Christian belief. Illustrating these anti-Christian assertions was the claim, and this is the humanistic statement of self-actualization, people need not repent their wrongdoings. Hence, repentance was a feature of Christian but not humanistic self-actualization. Hence, in correlations with other measures, pro-Christian statements more likely predicted adjustment, whereas anti-Christian items pointed toward poorer psychological functioning. Most notably, perhaps, the pro-Christian and anti-Christian items within a single scale correlated negatively with each other. This outcome violated basic psychometric standards of scale development, which require a strong positive correlation among all items within a scale. So was this 150-item humanistic self-actualization scale compatible or incompatible with Christian commitments? The paradoxical answer was yes. This scale was both compatible and incompatible, as might be expected of a measure that was incommensurable with Christ as the ultimate standard. Inclusion of both post-Christian and anti-Christian items within a single instrument produced a scale that was largely irrelevant to Christian understandings of self-actualization. An ideologically naive use of this measure could therefore lead to the misleading conclusion that Christians fail to achieve the mental health benefits of self-actualization. Such a conclusion could promote a colonization of Christian beliefs by a humanistic ideological surround. Within the objectives of the integration research program, such data could instead support a disinterpretation of Christian self-functioning. Advocates of the emic perspective could applaud these results as proof that self-actualization has no real place in Christianity, thereby encouraging a ghettoization of Christian beliefs. Comparative rationality analysis is a procedure that asks Christians to respond to a psychological scale twice. First, they react to questionnaire items under standard conditions, responding to all items as intended by the creators of the scale. Then they respond to these very same items once again, but this time by evaluating whether each is consistent or inconsistent with personal religious commitments. Based on these assessments, items can be defined empirically as pro-Christian or as anti-Christian. This means that the scale taken under standard instructions can be rescored in a different way, this time expressing the assumptions of a Christian rather than a non-Christian ideological surround, of a Christian rather than a non-Christian rationality. For example, one measure of irrational beliefs based on a particular system of psychotherapy assumes that mental health requires full independence and that any belief in the necessity of depending upon others promotes psychopathology. According to this scale, for example, it is irrational to claim that people need a source of strength outside of themselves. Another supposed irrationality says, I try to consult an authority on important decisions. Unsurprisingly, Christians evaluated these beliefs as being rational rather than irrational in conformity with their commitment to depend upon God. At the same time, however, Christian and psychotherapeutic assumptions agreed that it was rational to believe that I like to stand on my own 2 feet. Once again, a scale based on an ideological surround of contemporary psychology or psychotherapy proved to be both compatible and incompatible with Christian beliefs and therefore was instead incommensurable. Analysis of the Christian evaluations of dependency and other so-called irrationalities made it possible to define a Christian system of rationality. Most therapeutic-based assessments of irrationality were ideologically compatible with Christian beliefs, but some were not. Quantitative comparisons between the Christian and psychotherapeutic scorings of irrationality once again revealed that Christian rationality was relatively more valid than the therapeutic rationality when used with Christians. Overall, these data revealed that the psychotherapeutic evaluation of dependency had a potential to colonize Christian commitments, and that a naive use of these irrationality scales could at best encourage a disinterpretation of Christian rationality. Finally, and then we'll try to sum things up in more general terms, statistical control procedures can examine the relationship between Christian commitments and psychological functioning after accounting for possible conflicts between ideological surrounds. In one project, numerous measures of Christian commitment were correlated with a broad array of scales assessing self-esteem, self-acceptance, and self-actualization. Christian commitments were more likely to predict unhealthy than healthy self-functioning. Being a Christian, if there was a significant effect, it suggested that Christians had unhealthy self-functioning, although most relationships, the majority of the relationships, proved to be non-significant. In this study, however, efforts were also made to assess self-actualization in humanistic terms that were clearly anti-Christian, and to assess Christian beliefs about sin and guilt that were clearly anti-humanistic. Statistical procedures then made it possible to subtract out the influences of anti-Christian and anti-humanistic language on the observed relationships. The result was that Christian commitments became overwhelmingly linked with healthier self-functioning. There were like 30 correlations in the matrix, and 20 of the 30 turned out to be significant, suggesting Christian psychological well-being or positive self-functioning. The result was that Christian commitments, again, became overwhelmingly linked with healthier self-functioning. Definitive interpretation of these results is complex, and if I live long enough, I'll need to do some more studies, but we'll see. Nevertheless, this outcome demonstrated the importance of understanding how ideological surrounds can condition supposedly objective, empirical assessments of Christian psychological functioning. Depending upon perspective, a failure to remain sensitive to the problem of incommensurability could promote conclusions about the relationship between Christianity and self-functioning that encourage colonization, disinterpretation, or ghettoization, depending upon your perspective. In summary, Christian psychology can be conceptualized as an attempt to narrate the answer to a centrally important question. Are Christianity and contemporary psychology incommensurable? Christian psychology argues that the empirically obvious and presumably non-controversial answer must be yes. The ultimate standard of Christianity is Christ. The ultimate standard of secular psychological science is not. In the absence of a shared common ultimate standard of evaluation, the two must be incommensurable by definition. To say that Christianity and psychology are incommensurable in no way means that they are necessarily incompatible. Relative to the incommensurable rationality of contemporary psychology, Christian rationality will include a vast array of compatible, incompatible, and unrelated ideological assumptions. Incommensurability therefore presents us not only with a challenge, but also with an opportunity. We should all work together, embracing both science and our faith, to clarify, actualize, and translate the implications of our Christian commitments. We should also collaborate in the social construction of a meta-perspective. This meta-perspective should help us avoid the problems of colonization, ghettoization, and disinterpretation. It will also encourage us to develop the conceptual and methodological innovations of a future objectivity that we can use in the service of Christian knowledge. All of us have essential contributions to make. Our goal should be to nurture the dynamic growth of a Christian rationality that we can pass on to future generations of Christian psychologists. Thank you.
And Paul, I'm going to just start off by asking, I'm curious, how do you at UTC, at a state university, proceed? Do you find yourselves on occasion being etic, on occasion being emic, on occasion being dialogic? Are you all of those in different times? And what has been the evolution of your journey there?
Well, I teach two main courses, and you wouldn't want to take the first course. It's introductory psychology, and so I try. It's a state-supported school, and I love UTC. I'm at the perfect place. I know I have a ex-faculty colleague who retired and said, "I'm so glad to get out of here," you know. So, but for me personally, it's a great place to be. And so, in my intro psych class, I try to define psychology different from the way textbooks define it. I define psychology as the discipline that attempts to understand the causes of persons through the scientific method. And the thing that's most importantly that's added there is persons. And I try to make it clear that persons is a cultural construct and that there are multiple psychologies. Psychologists are experts in persons, but since different psychologists at least implicitly define the person differently, they're experts in different things. So I encourage my students to understand that I'm not giving them the definitive word on psychology. I'm showing them a huge array of empirical findings that they can use in understanding their own vision of persons. And I do talk about Christian psychologists, and we talk about eliminative reductionist visions of the person and radical behaviorist visions of the person and cognitivist and psychoanalytic. And I don't take sides. I just want students to have a kind of cognitive nimbleness, a future objectivity where they can zip from place to place and think about the same data. And the same data are not data, they're not facts with a capital F. They fit into patterns, and it depends on how you define key concepts like persons. Now, the other class I teach is in the honors program. It's an introduction to the social sciences from 1600 to 1900. And in that particular class, we do it all in a way. Since we go to 1900, or approximately 1900. We don't do a lot of the etic approach. It's more of the philosophical foundations of science. But the first person we read is the reader of a French Catholic social theorist named René Girard. And he has a theory of everything. I'm not saying it's right, but it's a Christian theory of everything that you can bring in conversation with all the other philosophical foundations for later social scientific thought. We read Girard, and then we read Descartes' method, and then Locke's second treatise, and Fukuyama's The Anti-History of the Last Man is sort of a kind of triumphant narrative of modernist thought and globalization. And then we read Rousseau and Tocqueville and Marx and Engels and Nietzsche. I love Nietzsche, but I hate Nietzsche, but I love Nietzsche. And Durkheim and Freud. And so in that particular class, once again, it's about cognitive nimbleness and future objectivity. And I'm going to get in trouble. I'd get fired at a Christian school, but one of the requirements of this class is I tell my students, I don't want you to change your mind about anything, about what you believe deep down inside. because I want you to be more sophisticated. I want you to give me your best argument, and if I disagree with you, that gives me an opportunity of developing a better argument. Now, I'd get fired at Bryan for saying things like that, but at UTC, that's a good thing, you know. and so I encourage, and it's Chattanooga, it's not Berkeley, and so there are a lot of Christians in my class, and it's sort of like a breath of fresh air to read Rene Girard, but I have lots of skeptics who write wonderful papers, skeptical papers about Girard. And so I do have opportunities where I teach. I love where I teach. I have a great faculty in my department. It's not work, it's play. I get 5 days a week. I go in and I play with my colleagues, and then I do different things on the weekend. But I do have this opportunity. But it's about future objectivity. It's about a kind of cognitive nimbleness and an ability to put yourself in the position of other people and see other perspectives. I think that's really important to do.
About the study you were talking about earlier, how many subjects were involved in
Which
that?
one?
Can you give me a ballpark for all of them?
All of them had about 200. And actually the study on the empirical translation scheme, Trevor Milliron was a former student of mine, and he was a former student of Warren's, and he's on the faculty at Lee here. I don't think Trevor's here, but Trevor had a connection with people here at Bryan, and I had a UTC sample, and I had a Bryan sample. So I've never talked here before, but I've actually used Bryan students in my research before. So each study had about 200 or so.
And how were the studies validated?
Well, it all depends on what kind of validity you're talking about. I'm interested in looking at conceptually, ideologically meaning patterns. And so what I do is I use a lot of measures that are already validated. For example, the self-actualization scale, the first one was the short index of self-actualization. It was 15 items. It's taken directly from the writings of humanistic psychologists like Maslow and Rogers and other humanistic theorists, and it's been used in a couple of research projects. And so they have a track record. They have validity established in the literature. Now, when I first did the beliefs about sin scale, of course, that wasn't validated. That was the first attempt to validate that. So, and then the second self-actualization scale was the personal orientation inventory. It has 150 items, and that was much more widely used. And so you look for opportunities to make a point. You know, I'm not sitting there just saying, oh, I'll just naively just pick a question. I'll look at scales that have been used by people, and I think, well, there's a bias right there. And I'm not picking on existential ideology or humanistic psychology. I'm not trying to pick on them. I'm just trying to show that they're incommensurable. And so I'm an opportunist. I look for opportunities to develop new methodologies that allow me to show you the complexity of trying to understand what's going on in psychological research. It is empirical, but it is also normative. It is ideological. So, there are more complex studies I've done where I've combined methodologies that I didn't torture you with.
I'm wondering if you see this meta-perspective as a resonant kind of meta-perspective.
Now, that's a great question, because I've been sitting around trying to figure out what I mean by that too. Because I know that I have certain perspectives that are going to be very different from some. I'm a Quaker pacifist, and so I believe all kinds of things that are just really dumb. You're not going to buy them. And so, you know what it is? It's a city on a hill. And the city on the hill doesn't have just one building or one room. It's going to have Catholic territories, and it's going to have Catholic neighborhoods and Orthodox neighborhoods and evangelical neighborhoods, a really small Quaker neighborhood, an Anabaptist neighborhood. You know, it's going to be a city on the hill. And we're going to be inviting, and we're going to be loving, and we're going to build things up, and we're actually going to get along. And one of the things that happened in my UHAN class that I was talking about is my class is about the origins of the social sciences, 1600 to 1900. And the thing that happened was people who are anti-religion will use the 30 Years' War against you. They will beat beat you over the head with 1618 to 1648. These Catholics and these Protestants couldn't get along, and 35% of the German population was slaughtered, and why should we believe that you're followers of the Prince of Peace? And so we need to build a city on the hill where we can get along and do it right and be high up so we can be seen and show a model of love. And you know what? There are some neighborhoods that some of us won't visit very often. I have some really great Calvinist friends, but I'm not going to go. We're going to find Mexican food places to eat together or something. But it's a city on the hill. That's what I'm trying to say.
Thank you.
Thinking also about these studies, I think one of the questions I struggle with also in having designed questionnaires is how do we reconcile kind of response bias? In other words, gathering samples from Christian schools and secular schools, people respond in a certain way so they don't have to deal with their own incongruity. How do you kind of reconcile that as you're kind of interpreting your data?
I'm infinitely stupid about many things, and I don't have an easy answer to that thing either. But I do think that that's an interesting question. People are responding to questionnaires within a context because they're responding normatively rather than personally. I think what you're saying, and that gets back to what Warren was trying to say last night about experience. I mean, you've got to figure out how, look, there's this wonderful new opportunity. Postmodernism, I know most of you hate it, but it's this wonderful new opportunity. You can work together as a community, struggling to create a rationality and an empirical methodology that allows you to do those kinds of things. And so I don't know how to answer that on a case-by-case basis. I just know that you struggle with when there is something that comes up. It's a Christian question in a Christian community that you need to ask and figure out how to do. And there will be different ways of doing this. One of my problems with what people are actually doing versus what they're really doing is I don't actually always know how to handle it. There's these famous series of studies about helping on the way, the Good Samaritan studies, where the Christians actually spent more time on I think it was at Princeton these studies were run. The Christians spent more time helping some kind of hobo or homeless person at the time, and they helped the person. And the interpretation of that is these people weren't really sincerely caring about these people because the homeless person said, I don't need your help. And the person persisted. And the persistence was supposedly an indication of an intention that was selfish. I just want to look good, and I'm not being responsive to that person. So those are incredibly complicated things to work out, but those are incredibly important things to work on in order to explore, how to get at the real rationality to the extent there is such a thing as a real rationality.
Dr. Watson, thank you for
Paul.
sharing your perspective with us today. You've talked about the area of research. Could you speak to other specific areas in which we can communicate the idea of incommensurability to the contemporary psychology community?
To the contemporary psychology, well, I guess I don't know how to do it except I only know what I know. And the way I know to make a point in science is to be a scientist. And so I do think today I did talk about data, and this is going to be really far field. There was a poet in the 60s, 70s, his name was W.S. Merwin, and somebody asked him one time, what's your most worst kind of poetry, or worst kind of poem ever that you think are just wrong kinds of poems? He said, poems about writing poems are not good poems. Poems about life are good things. And so what I did in my career is I could have come up here and I had no data at all to sort of flesh out what I was saying. And so I did the research first as a kind of empirical foundation for making some points. If I had said something like disinterpretation, I could have been arrested for coining a disturbing new word, but I have some examples of that. And so I think what happens is a community will have many talented people within it. And there will be many people who will see opportunities for doing things that I don't see because just like Nietzsche said, I have my perspective. And so there will be opportunities in philosophy and philosophy of science. There'll be opportunities of writing papers, to analyzing therapies and doing all kinds of things. So I haven't answered your question because I think actually, look, I'm closer to the end of my career than the beginning. And so the most important people here are people like you, people who are going to school. Can you figure out how to create innovations and ideas that will be forceful and compelling? Can you take the story and make the story sound more interesting and more compelling? You don't want to build a slum on the top of a hill. You want to build a dynamic city that is growing its rationality, and people leave that city and go out into the world and they help other people. Through things like therapy. And so I don't know the answer to this question, but I do know that the answer to this question is actually you and the other students who are here. The really important, everyone here is really important, but the really important people here are under 30. So it's just true. Under 30. You guys, it's your game soon. It's yours. You get to run the whole thing. And so you have an opportunity to be enthusiastic and overcome roadblocks and people who are skeptical, and you figure that out. But just be confident that you can do that, and then try to tell stories, find good stories. I'm not saying this is a good story, but you look for good stories. And Stanton was doing this. He was saying, narrative is all the rage these days because of postmodernism, and later on narrative may not be the metaphor, but right now it's the metaphor. So find good stories, sign up, and advance the story.
Thank you.
It sounds like you're trying to focus on things we agree upon and things that aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. But what about when you run into ideological bases which do affect research and how we do psychology that are mutually exclusive? How do we handle, like, people being good and then the other side thinking people are not good?
Yeah. Well, let's see if I can. First of all, I think I've clarified this a little bit. I don't think Christians have to agree with each other. That's the first thing. On the city on the hill, I think there'll be many neighborhoods, and the Catholics will be saying things in their neighborhoods that the Quakers won't be saying, and the Charismatics won't be saying. And so I think disagreement is fine. And that was actually kind of the thing I was having a problem with harmony in this resonance model. I think discordance is something you have to tolerate it, and you have to live it. And I'm going to really lose all credibility here right now, because here's actually, the people who really were interested in my research before Eric, I came into my work one day and I got an email from Tehran. They wanted me to come to Tehran and talk about the psychology of religion. And I used to say, I play better in Tehran than in Peoria, but now that I'm here in Dayton, I think everything's okay. And so I interact with my friend, and I have a friend in Tehran. And we have many, many different points of view. And what Warren said yesterday was exactly the right thing. You don't have to agree with Muslims, but you have to develop structures of communication and conversation. And so I think as a pacifist, you talk to everyone and you figure out how to see what they're seeing and try the things in them that you can build up, you try to build up. And the things that you can't agree with, you articulate an increasingly compelling reality that allows you to argue against them. And I love Nietzsche. Here's Nietzsche. Nietzsche was not a relativist, I don't think. I'm not an expert in Nietzsche, but in the genealogy of morals, he's an absolutist. He tells you there are two absolutes: Rome versus Judea, Judea versus Rome. There are two ways to live in life. There's Rome, the love of power, and there's Judea, the power of love. Now, Nietzsche didn't think love in Judea was really love. It was some kind of squeamish, maudlin resentment disguised as something else, but he was wrong, okay? But I'm saying is, in Christian communities, when we have disagreements, we don't solve them with the love of power. We try to solve them with the power of love. It might take 2 or 3 centuries, but our commitment would not be to Rome, it would be to Judea. And so the goal would be to figure out how to constructively build the city on the hill where people disagree and there are discordances. And not only, and there are people on Muslim hills out there. You're going to have to talk to them or do terrible things to them, or they're going to do terrible things to you. I have friends in Karachi. I have friends in Tehran. We talk. They're friends. My friend in Tehran, he had a boy. He had a son. His son was Yahya. Yahya. Yahya, he's from the Bible. Yahya the Baptist. John the Baptist. And so, and you get to know people and you share things and you can interact with them. And I don't agree with him and he doesn't agree with me and everything. And we try to share things. But all I'm saying to you is that disagreements are healthy. One more example of that. The best friend I ever had was Albert Ellis. And I only met him on the phone once. He hated Christians, but he was honest to your face. And he was a scientist and he was rational and he would tell you exactly what he was thinking. It was wrong, but at least he would tell you. And then you could take what he said and you could test it scientifically and show him it was wrong. And by the end of his life, he backed off a little bit. And so the people who disagree with you are your best friends because they give you a chance to sharpen your own thinking and develop your own ability to love other people.
Afraid to ask the question.
Well, I'm now nervous about answering it.
Actually, you answered it just in part with your Albert Ellis example, but you have presented a very sophisticated a kind of meeting secular psychology on its own turf, both rationally and through research, empirical research. Yet we know that from the study of human judgment and decision making, one of robust finding is that we ignore disconfirming information. And I'm wondering, to what extent are these secular psychologists actually listening to you? Are you in some sense kind of giving a Christian a witness to this world of secular psychology? And if so, are they listening? Are they hearing? Are they accepting?
Yeah. Well, I don't know how to say. Well, my first answer, short, I don't care. But my second answer is and here's why I don't care. Actually, I've already said what it's not important what my colleagues think right now. What's important are the under 30s. Are you, in Kuhn's Structure Scientific Revolution, it wasn't that the old guys changed their mind, they just died. and so, the old guy, I'm me too. And so the question is can you give a compelling argument so that the next generations coming up have their minds while they're still malleable, moving in different directions? I'm more worried about the younger people out there than I'm worried about my colleagues. I love my colleagues. I love my department. And so I think the answer is not so much worrying about what other people right now think about you, but the up-and-coming generations. Are you creating the rationality in your books and in your teaching that will allow you to nurture a Christian rationality that is sophisticated and dynamic in the future? That's the question.
You mentioned earlier, just at the beginning, the work of Robert Roberts in kind of pioneering Christian psychology. And I was just wondering if you could comment on the relationship of your work to some of his work and how you see those interacting.
Well, I actually think we're on different tracks to some important degree. Bob Roberts is much more read than I am. He's much more philosophically sophisticated. He has stronger groundings and an explicit theology. There was something in our chapter that I didn't agree with, but he's first author, and I want that chapter to be his. He said, if you get your theology right, your life, I didn't say it exactly like this, but it says something like, if you get your theology right, things will work out. I don't believe anybody ever gets their theology right. But that doesn't mean I'm right and he's wrong. He's just working from his faith and his understanding of things. And so I remember reading Robert's article in JPT on Ellis. That was a great article. That was one of the things that got me to thinking about Ellis. And so he has done a remarkably wonderful job in bringing his faith into conversation with various theorists in psychology, Ellis, Rogers, and so forth. And I sat in good old Chattanooga, Tennessee. He didn't know who I was. I was reading his papers, and I was thinking, I can do something with that, and that's what I did.
really believe you've addressed this question several different times among the other ones, but if you had any further comments on, as a new generation seeking to change, in a sense, to change the world, do you believe it's better to focus on creating unity among the body, like of believers of Christianity, or should we be focusing more on creating dissonance and coming up with new views, not necessarily new views, but raising new points, as in you're focusing more on your Christian perspective? In other words, should we be focusing on our Christian perspectives and raising the dissonance and disagreeing with everybody who does not hold the same views, or should we be trying to form those beliefs together?
Should
In other
you
words,
challenge, or should you articulate conformity?
Right.
Right. The reason I'm a research psychologist is I try not to give people advice like that instead of a therapist. But my answer is, you have to have a kind of integrity that cares for the community and cares for yourself. You have to figure out what your strengths are and what the needs of the community are. And so the community needs all kinds of people with all kinds of strengths. Every young person here has something that is going to be easy to develop because it'll be a part of their integrity. And so part of your education is to discover what your integrity will be. To produce disagreements just for the sake of disagreements will go nowhere. But to blindly conform with things that you fundamentally disagree with doesn't nurture the community to become better. You have to understand where the community is, and you have to understand where you are, and the community's important, and you're important, and bringing the two together, that's the important dialogue.
Stay here, Paul. Thank you. Yes. Unbelievable. We are on time. We're on schedule. My wife is not going to believe this, but that's another issue. So I want to thank you all for your thoughtful questions. I want to thank Paul. I just want to say to you, Paul, your illustration of the city and the hill in various compartments is surely the case. I'm a just warrior and not a pacifist. That's totally secondary, but I'm Augustinian insofar as we strive for unity on those things which are primary.
Yeah, and Yoder used to talk to you guys, and it's okay.
That's
We'll
right.
talk with
Yeah. Diversity on the things that are secondary, but charity with respect to all things, period. And I sense a charitableness in all of our speakers thus far, particularly in Paul Watson. And I would say with Paul Watsonian enthusiasm, would you join me in thanking him?
Thank you.